You think you know what prejudice looks like? A scornful glance, a whispered insult, a door slammed in your face. But what if I told you it's much, much uglier than that? What if it's the sound of a dozen angry men on horseback, torches held high, circling your tiny cabin in the dead of night? Imagine you're Sarah Mitchell. You're huddled in a dark, musty root cellar. Your 3-year-old daughter, Emma, is trembling in your arms, her small hands clutching your dress. Outside, you can hear them, the self-righteous men of Clearwater Springs, Texas, their voices drunk on hatred, chanting for you to get out, to go back to where your kind belongs. How did it come to this? How did one woman and her little girl become the biggest threat in a town full of ranchers and gunslingers? The answer will chill you to the bone. Because it wasn't just about hate, it was about a secret so dark, so valuable, that people were willing to burn everything Sarah loved to the ground just to keep it buried. And it all started with a single, innocent blue ribbon. The sun in Clearwater Springs in 1875 didn't just shine, it punished. It beat down on the dusty main street, turning the air into a shimmering furnace. Sarah Mitchell felt it sting on her neck as she walked toward the general store. Her daughter Emma held tight against her hip. Emma was her whole world, a beautiful little girl with her father's dark, soulful eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. But in this town, her beauty was a sin, because Emma was half white, half Comanche, a half-breed. The word followed them like a stray dog, snarling and snapping at their heels everywhere they went. Sarah could feel the eyes on her back as she climbed the wooden steps of the store. The whispers that stopped the second she was in earshot. The way mothers pulled their own children a little closer, as if Sarah's existence was a contagious disease. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound in a room thick with silent hostility. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, offered a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. The other women in the store, the wives of important men, shifted away, creating a circle of empty space around Sarah and her daughter. It was a dance they did every time she came to town, a silent, cruel performance to remind her she didn't belong. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Mitchell," the storekeeper's wife said, her voice brittle. Sarah kept her own voice low and steady. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I need flour, sugar, and coffee, please." She laid the few coins she had on the counter. The money she earned washing and mending other people's clothes, the same people who scorned her, was barely enough to keep them fed. As Mrs. Henderson weighed the flour, Emma's eyes, full of a child's pure wonder, landed on a spool of colorful ribbons. She pointed a tiny finger at a bright blue one, the exact color of Sarah's eyes. "Mama, pretty," she whispered. The simple, innocent moment was a spark in a room full of gunpowder. From across the store, a voice cut through the air like a whip. "It's a disgrace," Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, declared. Her face was pinched into a permanent sneer, her gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her skin. "That some people insist on parading their mistakes in front of decent folk." The store fell dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Every eye was on Sarah. The heat on her cheeks wasn't from the sun anymore. It was the fire of pure humiliation. Emma buried her face in Sarah's dress. She was only 3, but she knew the sound of hate. Sarah's voice trembled, but she held her ground. "Emma is not a mistake. She is my daughter." Mrs. Abernathy let out a laugh that was sharp and ugly. "That half-savage child is a stain on this town, a constant reminder of your poor judgment. No decent family will ever accept you. The sooner you realize that and leave, the better for everyone." The words were stones, each one hitting Sarah with brutal force. She looked for a friendly face, a flicker of sympathy, but found nothing. Just cold eyes and nervous glances at the floor. This was her life, a prison of judgment without walls. Mrs. Henderson pushed the wrapped goods across the counter. "That will be $2.15, she mumbled, desperate for the scene to end. Sarah's hands shook as she counted her coins again. She was short, 20 cents short. The small, pathetic gap between what she had and what she needed felt like a chasm in that moment, a symbol of her failure to provide, to protect. I'm afraid I don't have enough," she whispered, the shame tasting like ash in her mouth. "Could I possibly pay you the rest next week?" No credit, Mrs. Henderson said almost too quickly, darting a frightened look at Mrs. Abernathy. Just then, Emma tugged on her dress. Mama sad? Otherwise, she asked, her sweet voice cutting through the cruelty. It shattered what was left of Sarah's composure. She knelt, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass. No, sweetheart. Mama's fine. She stood up and started to unwrap the package of sugar. I'll just take the flour today. But as she went to pay, the store door flew open with a bang, the bell clanging wildly. A man filled the doorway, a tall silhouette against the blinding sun. He stepped inside, and the entire atmosphere in the store shifted. The air grew thick, electric, like the moment right before lightning strikes. He was tall, with shoulders that spoke of raw power. His skin was the color of rich earth, his hair long and black. But it was his eyes that captured everyone's attention. They were the color of amber, and they missed nothing. He wore buckskin and carried a pistol low on his hip, moving with the coiled grace of a predator. This was James Broken Arrow, a Comanche scout who sometimes worked for the cavalry, a man who walked between two worlds and belonged to neither. His amber eyes took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. He saw Sarah's flushed face. He saw the hostile stares of the other women. He saw the small, frightened child hiding behind her mother's skirt. And then his gaze landed on Mrs. Abernathy, and his expression turned to stone. James Broken Arrow let the silence stretch, forcing every person in that store to stew in the tension he had brought in with him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, but it carried an authority that cut through the room like a razor. I believe I overheard, he said, his eyes still locked on Mrs. Abernathy. Did I understand you correctly? This woman and her child are not welcome here? The banker's wife, accustomed to being the most powerful woman in any room, lifted her chin. This is a respectable establishment. We have a right to feel comfortable. James took a slow step forward. The floorboards creaked under his weight. He seemed to suck all the air out of the store, making it smaller. And what exactly is making you uncomfortable? A mother trying to buy food for her child? That child, Mrs. Abernathy spat, her voice dripping with venom, is half savage. She doesn't belong with civilized people. The word savage hung in the air. It was a declaration of war. James didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He did something far more powerful. He looked down at little Emma, who was peeking out from behind her mother's legs, her dark eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. And then he knelt. He brought himself down to her level, a giant of a man meeting the gaze of a tiny girl. Hello, little warrior, he said softly in English. Then he spoke a few words in Comanche. The sound was liquid and beautiful, and it had a magical effect. A small giggle escaped Emma's lips. It was the first sound of joy in that store all day. James stood up slowly, his amber eyes now blazing with a controlled fire. He turned that fire back on Mrs. Abernathy. This child has the blood of the Comanche people in her veins, he said, his voice a low growl. That makes her part of a nation that has survived this land for generations. A nation of warriors. If that is your definition of savage, then you are a fool. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a worn leather pouch, and spilled a cascade of coins onto the counter. They rang out in the suffocating silence. I will pay for whatever the lady and her daughter require, he announced. Then he looked at Sarah, and for a split second, the hardness in his face softened. And add a blue ribbon to the order, the one that matches her mother's eyes. The simple act was a direct challenge, a line drawn in the dust. Mrs. Abernathy's face contorted with rage. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was a public undermining of her authority, and she knew exactly who James was. He wasn't just some drifter. He was a man who knew things. Things her husband, the banker, would prefer stay hidden. You have no right, she hissed. I have every right, James shot back, his hand moving to rest casually on the hilt of his pistol. This child is Comanche. That makes her my people, and we protect our own. He stepped beside Sarah, a human shield between her and the hate-filled stares. If anyone here has a problem with that, they can take it up with me. Right now. No one moved, no one breathed. The challenge hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Finally, Mrs. Abernathy, defeated and furious, gathered her skirts and stormed toward the door. "This is not over," she muttered, a promise and a threat. "No," James agreed quietly, his eyes following her out. "It's just beginning." One by one, the other women scurried out, avoiding his gaze. Soon only Sarah, Emma, James, and the terrified Mrs. Henderson were left. James helped Sarah gather her things, now paid for in full, including the bright blue ribbon that Emma clutched in her hand like a treasure. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice choked with emotion she couldn't name. "You didn't have to do that." James looked down at her, then at Emma, who was now bravely tugging on his buckskin jacket. He didn't smile. The danger hadn't passed. It had just changed shape. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "I did. But what I did in there, it wasn't for you." Sarah stared at him, confused. He knelt down again, this time looking at both Sarah and Emma. His next words would change everything. "I did it for her father," James said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Running Wolf was my blood brother, and I made him a promise on the day he died, a promise to protect his family." Sarah's world tilted. This wasn't a random act of kindness from a stranger. This was a sacred debt being paid, and she and Emma were standing right in the middle of it. The fight in the store wasn't the end of something. It was the start, and Sarah had a terrifying feeling that the battle for their lives had only just begun. The ride back to Sarah's small homestead was quiet, but it was a new kind of quiet. Not the lonely, empty silence she was used to, but one filled with unspoken questions and the heavy weight of James's revelation. He rode beside her rickety wagon, his black stallion moving with a powerful grace that made her own tired horse look pathetic. He was Running Wolf's blood brother. The words echoed in her mind. Her husband, a man of few words, had never spoken of a blood brother. He had been a man caught between two worlds, just like their daughter. A scout for the army, respected by the soldiers, but always an outsider. A Comanche warrior who had left his people to marry a white woman. Emma, however, seemed to understand things on a level beyond words. She kept twisting around on the wagon seat to stare at James, her initial shyness replaced by an intense, solemn curiosity. "Mama," she finally whispered, her voice loud in the still afternoon air. "Why did the man speak like Papa?" Sarah's breath hitched. She had tried to keep the Comanche language alive for Emma, whispering words and songs to her at night. But hearing it from this stranger had unlocked something deep inside the child. James heard her. He guided his horse closer. "Because your papa and I spoke the same language. We shared the same heart." He looked at Sarah. "I knew Running Wolf my whole life. We were raised together. When he told me he had met a woman with hair like corn silk and eyes the color of the sky, I worried for him. Our people have not always been treated well by yours." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes. "He told you about me?" "He told me everything," James said, his voice soft with memory. "He said you were fierce and kind, and that you saw the man, not just the Comanche. He said you gave him a home his heart had been searching for." His gaze shifted to Emma. "And he told me about his daughter. Little Moon, he called her. He said she had the spirit of a warrior in the heart of a flower." Hearing these lost words from her husband, spoken by this man, was like finding water in a desert. It was a gift she never expected. A piece of her husband returned to her. But the beautiful memory was shattered by a sudden, acrid smell on the wind. Smoke. James's head snapped up, his nostrils flaring. His entire body went rigid, his hand instantly going to the gun on his hip. He wasn't a friendly companion anymore. He was a warrior sensing danger. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her own heart starting to pound. "Get down," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. He spurred his horse forward, galloping ahead around the bend in the road. Sarah pulled the wagon to a halt and scrambled down, pulling a confused Emma with her. They crouched behind the wagon, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the buzzing of insects. Then they heard it, a crackling roar. Sarah peeked around the wagon wheel. Through the trees, she could see a pillar of thick black smoke rising into the blue sky. It was coming from the direction of her home, her garden, her chickens, everything she had worked so hard to build since Running Wolf's death. A wave of pure terror washed over her. Mrs. Abernathy's threat echoed in her ears. This is not over. She hadn't wasted any time. James came galloping back, his face a mask of fury. "It's your barn," he said, his words clipped. They set fire to it. They hadn't just insulted her. They hadn't just threatened her. They had crossed a line. This was an attack. "We have to go back to town," Sarah stammered, her mind reeling. "To the sheriff." James's laugh was harsh and bitter. "The sheriff? Sarah, who do you think gave them the matches?" The blood drained from her face. Of course. Sheriff Miller was a close friend of the Abernathys. He ate at their table, drank their whiskey. The law in this town wasn't a shield for people like her. It was a weapon used against them. They were completely, terrifyingly alone. "What do we do?" she whispered, pulling Emma tighter. James's amber eyes scanned the horizon, calculating, planning. The time for quiet protection was over. "We don't run," he said, his voice deadly calm. "We fight back. They think you're a helpless widow. They think I'm just a lone scout. They're about to find out how wrong they are." He looked down at the smoldering remains of her barn, at the black smoke tainting the sky. "This isn't just about prejudice anymore, Sarah," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "Abernathy didn't do this because his wife was insulted. He did this because he's scared. Running Wolf knew something, something that could destroy the banker and his friends. And I think Abernathy is terrified that he told you what it was." Suddenly, the world shifted again. She wasn't just a victim of hate. She was the keeper of a secret she didn't even know she had. A secret her husband had died to protect. And a secret that might just get her and her daughter killed. They didn't go to the cabin. Not yet. James led them off the main path, deep into a thicket of cottonwood trees by the creek, his movements swift and silent. He was a different man now. The calm, protective presence had been replaced by a tightly coiled intensity, the focus of a hunter. "They'll be watching the house," he said in a low voice, helping Sarah and Emma off the wagon and tethering the horses where they couldn't be seen from the road. "They'll want to see you panic, see you run. It would justify everything in their minds." "But our home," Sarah started, her mind still struggling to catch up. "A home can be rebuilt," James cut her off, his tone sharp but not unkind. "A life cannot. We need to think. What did Running Wolf talk to you about in his last weeks? Did he seem worried? Did he mention any documents, any maps?" Sarah shook her head, feeling helpless. "No. He was sick with the fever. He was delirious most of the time. He just talked about us, about how much he loved us." She felt a fresh pang of grief, a frustration that she couldn't provide the clue he was looking for. James's expression was grim. He crouched down, drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick. "The fever, that's the official story. But I never believed it. Running Wolf was strong. He'd survived worse winters, worse illnesses. His death felt wrong." He looked up at her, his eyes boring into hers. "Abernathy is the town banker. He handles land deeds, loans, railroad contracts. That's where the power is. That's where the secrets are buried." A cold dread crept up Sarah's spine. "Are you saying Running Wolf was murdered?" "I'm saying a man like Abernathy doesn't burn down a barn over a few harsh words in a general store," James replied. "He does it to send a message. He's telling you to keep your mouth shut about something you don't even know you know." The sheer evil of it was staggering. They weren't just cruel, they were criminals. And her husband had been their victim. The grief she had carried for 3 years was suddenly twisted with a new, fiery emotion. Rage. Emma, sensing the shift in her mother, whimpered softly. Sarah pulled her onto her lap, stroking her hair. "It's okay, my love. Mama's here." She looked at James, her blue eyes hard with a resolve he hadn't seen before. "What do we do?" "First, we survive the night," he said. "Then we find what Running Wolf hid." As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, James taught her things she never imagined she'd need to know. How to muffle the horse's hooves with rags. How to move through the underbrush without making a sound. He gave Emma a game. "Be as quiet as a mouse, little warrior. It's how we'll sneak past the coyotes." Under the cover of darkness, they made their way back to the homestead, approaching from the creek, staying low. The barn was a heap of blackened, smoldering timbers, the smell of burnt wood hanging heavy in the air. The main cabin was untouched, a dark shape against the starry sky. "They're out there," James whispered, pointing toward a small ridge overlooking the property. "Two of them, watching." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. They were being hunted. "We need to get inside," she whispered back. "There are things, my husband's things. Maybe there's a clue." James nodded. "I'll create a diversion on the other side of the property. It will draw them away for a few minutes. When you hear the sound of a hawk's cry 3 times, that's your signal. You'll have 5 minutes. Get what you need and get to the root cellar. Don't come out for any reason until I come for you. Do you understand?" Sarah nodded, her mouth dry with fear. He put a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm and reassuring. "You can do this, Sarah. You have that fire he always talked about." He then looked at Emma and smiled faintly. "And you have the spirit of a warrior." With that, he melted into the darkness, as silent as a shadow. Sarah and Emma waited, hidden in the tall grass by the creek. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The chirping of the crickets sounded deafeningly loud. Sarah clutched a small hand trowel, the only weapon she could find in the wagon. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then she heard it, a high-pitched screech from the woods to the east. A hawk. Once, twice, 3 times. "Now, baby," she whispered to Emma. "We have to be fast." Holding Emma in one arm and the trowel in the other, Sarah ran. She'd never run so fast in her life. Her bare feet flew across the cool earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She reached the cabin, fumbled with the latch, and burst inside, slamming the door shut behind her. The cabin was just as she'd left it. Humble, clean, safe. But it wasn't safe anymore. It was a trap. She rushed to the small wooden chest at the foot of her bed. It held everything she had left of Running Wolf. His spare moccasins, a beaded pouch, a single eagle feather. She frantically searched through them, her hands shaking. Nothing. No maps, no papers, no clues. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. It was hopeless. Suddenly Emma, who had been standing silently by the stone hearth, pointed. "Papa's rock," she said. Sarah looked. It was one of the hearthstones, slightly looser than the others. Running Wolf had built the fireplace himself. He'd always said, "A strong hearth is the heart of a strong home." He used to tap that specific rock sometimes, a little secret ritual she'd never understood. Her heart leaped. Using the trowel, she pried at the edges of the stone. It was heavy, but it shifted. Grunting with effort, she pulled it free. Behind it was a small, dark cavity, and inside that cavity was a leather-wrapped bundle. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. It was an oilskin pouch. She untied the leather thong and unrolled it on the floor. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a deed. It was a ledger. The pages were filled with her husband's neat, careful handwriting, columns of names, dates, and numbers. She recognized some of the names: Abernathy, the banker, Sheriff Miller, even the name of a U.S. senator she'd read about in the papers. Next to the names were figures, payments, and descriptions of parcels of land. Comanche land. Land that was supposed to be protected by treaty. The ledger was a detailed record of a massive conspiracy to illegally seize land from the Comanche, bribing officials and forging documents. Running Wolf hadn't just stumbled upon a secret. He had been investigating it, documenting it. He hadn't died from a fever. He'd been silenced. This ledger wasn't just a clue. It was proof. Proof that could send the most powerful men in the state to prison. As the magnitude of what she was holding sank in, she heard a noise outside. A man's voice, angry and close. "The hawk was a trick! She's in the house!" Footsteps pounded on the porch. The door handle rattled violently. They had been too slow. The diversion hadn't worked long enough. They were trapped. Sarah grabbed the ledger and Emma, her mind racing. The root cellar. James's instructions. She ran to the back of the cabin, to the small trap door hidden under a rug. Just as she pulled it open, the front door of the cabin crashed inward, splintered wood flying across the room. 2 men stood silhouetted in the doorway. One was the town blacksmith, a hulking brute named Jeb. The other was the sheriff himself, his badge glinting in the moonlight, his gun drawn. "Nowhere left to run, Mrs. Mitchell," the sheriff said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "The banker wants to see you, and he wants what you just found." Sarah's blood ran cold. He knew. He knew about the ledger. This was it, the end of the line. She clutched Emma, who was crying now, and held the heavy ledger like a shield. She had a choice: surrender the proof that could avenge her husband or die protecting it. But just as the sheriff took a step into the cabin, a shadow detached itself from the rafters above him. It was James. He dropped down behind them, as silent as the grave. Before the sheriff or his brute could even turn around, James moved. It was a blur of motion, a flash of steel. There was a sickening thud, and the blacksmith crumpled to the floor without a sound. The sheriff spun around, his eyes wide with shock, but he was too late. James disarmed him with a swift, brutal movement, sending the pistol clattering across the floor. He slammed the sheriff against the wall, a long knife pressed against his throat. "You made a mistake coming here," James snarled, his voice a low whisper of death. The sheriff, his face pale with terror, could only stammer. "Broken Arrow. We just want the book." "I know what you want," James hissed, "but what you're going to get is justice." He looked over at Sarah, his amber eyes burning with an intensity that took her breath away. "Get to the cellar, now." Sarah didn't hesitate. She scrambled down the ladder into the cool darkness below, pulling the heavy door shut just as she heard the sound of more men approaching outside. She was safer for the moment, but she was trapped in a dark hole with her crying daughter, holding a book that had gotten her husband killed. And upstairs, the only man in the world who could protect them was facing a mob, alone. The fight for survival had just turned into an all-out war. The darkness of the root cellar was absolute. It smelled of damp earth and potatoes. Sarah held Emma close. Her own heart beat a frantic drum against the child's small back. Above them, the sounds were muffled but terrifying. Shouts, the thud of bodies hitting the floorboards, the splintering of furniture. James was up there, fighting for their lives, alone. Emma was no longer crying. She was rigid with fear, her small body trembling. "Mama," she whispered, her voice tiny. "Is Papa James okay?" Papa James. The name struck Sarah's heart with a strange mix of hope and terror. In just one day, this man had become a father figure to her daughter, a protector, a possibility, and now he might die for them. "He's a great warrior, sweetheart," Sarah whispered back, trying to keep the tremor out of her own voice. "He will be fine." But she didn't believe it. There were too many of them. She had seen the torches. A dozen men, maybe more. One man, no matter how skilled, couldn't fight a mob. The sounds of the fight upstairs stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. Who had won? Were the sheriff's men standing over James's body right now? Were they about to lift the cellar door and find them? Sarah's mind raced. The ledger felt heavy in her hands, a curse. Maybe she should just give it to them. Maybe they would let her and Emma go if she did. But she knew that was a lie. They couldn't afford to leave witnesses. Running Wolf had trusted her to be strong. James was trusting her now. She crawled over to the far corner of the cellar, prying at the dirt floor with her fingers. She would bury the ledger. If they found her, if they killed her, at least the proof wouldn't die with her. At least someone, someday, might uncover the truth. Just as she started to dig, she heard a soft tapping on the cellar door. 3 distinct taps. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it a trick? "Sarah?" James's voice, a low whisper. Relief washed over her so powerfully her knees went weak. She scrambled back to the ladder. "James, are you all right?" "I'm fine," he whispered back. "They've retreated for now, but they'll be back, with more men. Open the door." She pushed the heavy door up. James stood there, his face bruised and a cut bleeding freely above his eye. The cabin was a wreck. The sheriff and the blacksmith were tied up and gagged in a corner, both unconscious. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ledger in her hand. "Is that it? Is that what he was hiding?" Sarah nodded, holding it out to him. He took it, his eyes scanning the first page. A grim understanding settled on his face. This is worse than I thought. This goes all the way to Washington. He looked back at her, the urgency in his eyes more intense than ever. They won't just come back with more men, Sarah. They'll come back to burn this cabin to the ground with us inside it, just to destroy this book. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Sarah's relief. Where can we go? The whole town is against us. Not the whole town, James said, but we can't stay here. There's a place, a Comanche settlement 2 days west of here. My cousin is the chief. They've made peace with the government, but they live by the old ways. You and Emma would be safe there. You would be accepted. A new life, safety, acceptance for Emma. It was everything she had ever prayed for. And you? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. James's amber eyes finally met hers, and in them she saw something that had nothing to do with duty or promises to a dead friend. It was something deeper, something raw and real. I would be there with you, he said, his voice low. This ledger, it's the key. With this we can bring justice for Running Wolf, but I can't do it alone, and I won't leave you and Emma unprotected. He took a step closer, reaching out to gently brush a stray piece of hair from her face. His touch sent a jolt through her. Sarah, he said, his voice dropping even lower, this is not how I imagined this moment. But we are out of time. The world sees you as a white woman. It sees Emma as a half-breed. Alone, you are vulnerable. But there is a way to protect you both, under Comanche law and white law. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it would burst from her chest. She knew what he was going to say before he said it. Marry me, he said. The words simple, direct, and utterly world-altering. Come with me not just for safety, but as my wife. Let me protect you not as a duty to my friend, but as a duty to my family, to our family. It wasn't a proposal born of romance and courtship. It was a proposal forged in violence and desperation, a lifeline thrown to her in a raging storm. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw more than just a strategic alliance. She saw honesty. She saw respect. She saw a future she had never dared to dream of, a future where her daughter wouldn't have to hide who she was, a future where she wouldn't be alone. But before she could answer, a new sound cut through the night, the baying of hounds. They weren't just coming back with more men. They were coming back to hunt them down like animals. There was no more time for choices. There was only time for survival. There's a hidden tunnel, Sarah said suddenly, her mind racing back to another one of her husband's secrets. Running Wolf dug it when he first built the cabin. In case of a raid, it comes out by the creek. James's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. Show me. She led him back to the root cellar, to the far wall. Behind a stack of old crates was a section of wall that looked like solid earth, but was actually a cleverly disguised wooden door. James pulled it open, revealing a narrow, dark tunnel. Freedom. We can make it, he said, grabbing a sack and quickly filling it with what little food they had. He slung the tied-up sheriff over one shoulder. He's our insurance policy. He turned to Sarah. Go. Take Emma and the ledger. I'll be right behind you. Sarah didn't argue. She took Emma's hand and plunged into the darkness of the tunnel. It was tight and claustrophobic. The air was stale, but it was a path to safety. As they neared the end, she could feel a cool breeze, smell the sweet scent of the night-blooming jasmine that grew by the creek. They were going to make it. She pushed open the exit, a small hatch covered with leaves and branches, and scrambled out into the moonlight. She took a deep breath of fresh, clean air, but the relief lasted only a second. Standing there waiting for them was a group of men, but they weren't from the town. They weren't white. They were Comanche warriors, at least 10 of them, armed and painted for battle. And at their head was a man with a face so similar to James's, it could only be his cousin, the chief, their savior. But he wasn't smiling, and his warriors had their arrows aimed directly at Sarah's heart. You are not welcome here, the chief said, his voice cold and hard as stone. The safe haven was a trap. The one place they were running to for protection was the most dangerous place of all. They had escaped the fire only to be caught in the jaws of the wolf. Sarah froze, her body a statue of pure terror. Emma clung to her leg, whimpering. The arrowheads aimed at them glinted in the moonlight, promising a swift and silent death. This was a nightmare from which there was no waking. The Comanche chief, James's cousin, took a step forward. His face was a mask of grim duty. His name was Stone Hoof, and there was no warmth in his eyes, none of the kindness she had imagined. "You have brought trouble to this land, white woman," Stone Hoof said, his English clear and sharp. "My brother has forgotten his duty to his people. He has been blinded by a ghost and a promise." Just then, James emerged from the tunnel, the unconscious sheriff still slung over his shoulder. He saw the warriors, saw his cousin, and his face hardened. He gently lowered the sheriff to the ground, his hand never leaving his knife. "Brother," James said, his voice a low warning, "what is the meaning of this? This is Sarah, Running Wolf's widow. She and her child need our protection." "Running Wolf is dead," Stonehoof replied coldly. "His choices died with him. Our agreement with the white men in Washington is fragile. They give us this land, and in return, we do not interfere. We do not cause trouble. This book you carry," he gestured toward the ledger in Sarah's hand, "this is trouble. It speaks of crimes committed by powerful men. If we are found with it, the treaty will be broken. The soldiers will come. Our people, our women and children, will suffer." The horrifying truth crashed down on Sarah. Stonehoof wasn't motivated by malice. He was motivated by fear, a deep, justifiable fear for the survival of his people. He was willing to sacrifice her and Emma to protect his own. "So you would stand by and let these men get away with murder?" James demanded, his voice ringing with disbelief and betrayal. "The murder of a Comanche man, of your own blood?" "My duty is to the living, not the dead," Stonehoof shot back. "I have already made a new agreement, a better one. Mr. Abernathy is a reasonable man. He has promised to double our yearly supplies from the government if we simply return what was stolen from him, and if we return the thief." He looked pointedly at James. The betrayal was absolute. His own family, his own blood, had sold him out. They had traded his life, and the lives of Sarah and Emma, for blankets and flour. From the woods behind them, more figures emerged. Mr. Abernathy, the banker, looking smug and triumphant, and behind him a dozen armed men from the town, their torches casting a hellish glow on the scene. It was an ambush, a perfectly coordinated trap. "It's over, Broken Arrow," Abernathy called out, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You have nowhere to run. Give me the ledger, and I'll let your cousin's people live in peace. As for you and the woman, well, you've caused me a great deal of trouble." It was a death sentence. They were caught between two forces, the cold, pragmatic fear of the Comanche and the hot, greedy hatred of the townspeople. There was no escape. James stood his ground, a lone warrior between two armies, protecting a woman and a child. He looked from his cousin's stony face to Abernathy's cruel smile. Sarah could see the agony in his eyes. To fight his own people was unthinkable, but to surrender meant death and the failure of the promise he made to Running Wolf. He was trapped. But then something happened that no one could have predicted. Little Emma, who had been silent and trembling, let go of her mother's skirt. She took a small, wobbly step forward into the space between the warriors and the townsmen. She was so small, so fragile, in this clearing full of armed, angry men. She looked at Stonehoof, her head held high. And then, in a voice that was clear and pure, she began to sing. It was a Comanche song, a lullaby that Sarah had sung to her every night, a song that Running Wolf had taught Sarah, a song about courage and truth and the strength of the spirit. The sound of the child's voice singing the ancient words of their people cut through the tension like a knife. The Comanche warriors shifted, their hard expressions faltering. They looked at the small girl, a daughter of their people, singing a song of their ancestors, a song that reminded them of who they were, of the honor they were supposed to uphold. Stonehoof's face contorted in a mask of shame and conflict. The child's innocence was a more powerful weapon than any arrow or gun. Abernathy, seeing his control of the situation slipping, grew furious. "Shut that child up!" he roared. "Seize them!" But his command was a moment too late. The song had created a crack in the wall of hate and fear, and James' broken arrow was about to shatter it completely. Using that single moment of hesitation, James moved. He wasn't attacking his kin. He was making a choice. He grabbed the ledger from Sarah, strode into the middle of the clearing, and held it high for all to see. "You are all fooled," he roared, his voice booming with power and conviction. He looked at his cousin. "You think Abernathy is your friend? You think his promises are worth more than the honor of our people? This book proves he is a snake." Then he spun to face Abernathy and the townsmen. "And you follow this man because he lines your pockets, but he is a liar and a murderer. This ledger doesn't just list his crimes against the Comanche, it lists his crimes against you." He opened the book, his voice ringing out in the night. "It's all here. How he swindled your ranches with impossible loans. How he conspired with the railroad to run you off your own land. He hasn't just been stealing from my people, he's been stealing from all of you." The townsmen began to murmur, looking at each other, then at the furious banker. The seeds of doubt had been planted. "He's lying!" Abernathy shrieked, his composure finally breaking. "Kill them! Kill them all!" He raised his own pistol, aiming it not at James, but at the easiest target, the one who had started it all. Little Emma. But before he could fire, an arrow flew through the air. It didn't come from James. It came from Stone Hoof. The arrow struck Abernathy's gun, sending it flying from his hand. Stone Hoof strode forward, his face a thundercloud of renewed purpose. He stood beside James, his brother, facing the stunned townsman. "My brother speaks the truth," Stone Hoof declared, his voice filled with the authority of a chief. "We have been blinded by fear. No more. The Comanche do not bargain with murderers and thieves." The tide had turned. The alliance of hate was broken. The townsmen, seeing Abernathy for the snake he was, and now facing a united and furious band of Comanche warriors, threw down their weapons. Justice, swift and brutal, had finally arrived in Clearwater Springs. The aftermath was a blur. Abernathy and the now conscious Sheriff Miller were taken captive by Stone Hoof's warriors, bound and destined for a federal judge who couldn't be bought. The ledger, the proof of their crimes, was the key that would unlock their prison cells. The other townsmen, freed from Abernathy's influence, were ashamed and repentant. They saw Sarah not as an outcast, but as the widow of a man who had tried to save them all from a predator in their midst. The hatred that had burned so hot just hours before had been extinguished by the clean, cold light of truth. As the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky with soft shades of pink and gold, Sarah stood with James by the creek. Emma, exhausted but safe, was asleep in Stone Hoof's lodge, being cared for by the Comanche women. For the first time, she was being seen not as a half-breed, but as a cherished daughter of the tribe. "He would be proud of you," James said quietly, looking at Sarah. "Both of you. Running Wolf knew you were strong, but I don't think even he could have imagined this." Sarah watched the water flowing in the creek, washing over the smooth stones. It felt like her life was being washed clean, the years of fear and loneliness carried away by the current. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we build," James replied. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It felt natural. "Right. Stone Hoof has offered you a home with our people. You and Emma will always be welcome. But your home is here, the one you and Running Wolf built. This town needs to heal, and they need to see you, to see Emma, to be reminded of what courage looks like." He turned to face her, his amber eyes serious. "My proposal from before, it was born from desperation. I want to ask again, now, in the light of day. Not because you need my protection, but because my life, which has been spent wandering between two worlds, would finally have a center if you were in it. Marry me, Sarah. Not to save your life, but to share it with me." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, but for the first time in years they were tears of joy. She thought of the journey, the fire, the terror, the betrayal, and she thought of the little girl singing a song of truth in the face of death. Her daughter hadn't just saved them, she had shown them the way. Love was not about safety, it was about courage. "Yes," she whispered, Yes, I'll marry you. They didn't just rebuild the barn, they rebuilt a community. The story of the ledger of Abernathy's greed and Running Wolf's quiet heroism changed Clearwater Springs forever. The invisible walls that had isolated Sarah and Emma came crumbling down. Emma's mixed heritage was no longer a source of shame, but a symbol of the two worlds learning to live as one. Sarah, James, and Emma became a family forged in fire, a testament to the fact that love is more powerful than hate, truth is sharper than any weapon, and sometimes the bravest warrior is a little girl with a song in her heart. They found their justice not by running away, but by standing their ground and fighting for the truth, creating a home not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. The story of Sarah and Emma is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on a battlefield, but in our own communities and in our own hearts. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're standing alone. If their journey from outcasts to heroes touched your heart, and if you believe that one person's courage can change the world, then please consider subscribing to our channel. We are dedicated to bringing you more stories of unsung heroes, of love against all odds, and of the enduring power of the human spirit. Click that subscribe button and become part of a community that celebrates these incredible stories. And don't forget to hit the like button if you were moved by Sarah's strength and James's honor. What part of their story gave you the most chills? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.